The desert sun had bleached the blood from Thaddeus Crane's hands, but the weight of what he'd done still pressed against his ribs like broken glass. 3 days had passed since the shooting at Devil's Tank, 3 days since he'd pulled that trigger and watched Diego Vasquez drop face first into the alkali dust. Now he stood before the Apache elder, whose weathered face held 60 winters of wisdom and war, listening to words that would reshape everything he thought he knew about his own life. "You saved my tribe," the elder said, each syllable carrying the weight of mountains. "Now I give you my daughter as wife." Thaddeus felt his throat close. The Apache camp stretched behind the old man like something that had grown from the red earth itself, wickiups and lean-tos scattered among the mesquite and palo verde. Women moved between the structures with eyes that tracked his every breath. Children peered from doorways and warriors stood with hands resting easy on rifle stocks. All of them waiting to see what the white man would do with an offer that had never been made to an outsider before. The girl stepped forward then, and Thaddeus forgot how to breathe properly. She moved like water over stone-silver ornaments in her black hair, catching firelight and throwing it back in patterns that made his eyes water. Her deerskin dress bore beadwork so intricate it must have taken months to complete each tiny piece, placed with the patience of someone who understood that beautiful things couldn't be rushed. But it was her face that stopped his heart, the way she looked at him without fear or submission. Just a clear-eyed assessment that suggested she knew exactly what was being offered and what it would cost. "Her name is Ayana," said Nalish, the war leader, who spoke English with the careful precision of a man who'd learned it from missionaries and soldiers. "She has 20 summers. She reads 4 languages. The Franciscan nuns in Santa Fe taught her numbers and writing, but she chose to return to us because book learning cannot teach someone how to live." Thaddeus tried to find words that wouldn't shame him. This girl, this woman, represented everything he'd spent 5 years running from. Roots, responsibility, the terrible possibility that someone might depend on him for more than he could give. He drifted from Ohio to Arizona precisely because he didn't want anyone's expectations weighing him down, didn't want to build anything that could be destroyed by bad luck or worse judgment. "I don't understand your ways," he managed finally. Ayana spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the musical quality of someone comfortable with multiple languages. "Neither do I understand yours. But understanding can be learned while courage cannot be taught." The elder gestured toward the fire burning in the center of camp. "3 suns ago, you stood with my warriors against men who would have taken our women and children to the slave markets in Sonora. You owed us nothing, yet you fought like one of our own sons. Such a deed creates obligations that cannot be paid with horses or silver." Thaddeus remembered that fight with crystalline clarity. How Vasquez and his 13 riders had come howling out of the desert like demons expecting to find one exhausted cowboy and his dying horse. Instead, they'd run straight into an Apache war party that had been tracking them for days, waiting for the right moment to settle old scores. The battle had lasted maybe 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes had changed everything. "What makes you think I'm worth this honor?" Thaddeus asked. The elder studied him with eyes that had seen too much death to be impressed by false modesty. "A man's worth is not measured by his words, but by what he does when everything depends on his choice. You chose to stand with us against those who prey on the innocent. That tells me more about your heart than any speech could reveal." A ceremony began that evening. Rituals Thaddeus didn't understand, but found himself participating in anyway. He accepted gifts he couldn't name, spoke words in Apache that Nalish taught him, danced around fires that made him feel like he was moving through someone else's dream. Through it all, Ayana watched from the edge of the circle, her dark eyes reflecting flames and something deeper, something that might have been curiosity or might have been resignation. When the formal ceremonies ended and the camp settled into its evening routines, Thaddeus found himself alone with her, beside a small fire that had been prepared outside a wickiup that he realized with something approaching panic was apparently now his home. The desert night wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, bringing with it the sounds of a community at rest and the vast silence of wilderness beyond. She offered him coffee in a battered pot that looked like it had seen a dozen trading seasons, and they sat without speaking for several minutes, each waiting for the other to begin a conversation that neither seemed prepared for. "You're afraid," she said finally, not a question. "Terrified," he admitted, because lying seemed like a poor foundation for whatever they were supposed to build. "Good. Fear means you understand that this matters. A man who feels nothing when his life changes completely is either dead inside or lying to himself. Her pragmatism surprised him. This wasn't the romantic notion of marriage from penny novels, but something more honest, a partnership based on mutual need rather than passionate declarations that might not survive the morning light. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried weight that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "Because my people are dying. Not from bullets, though those take their share. We're dying from forgetting who we are, from being told that our ways are worthless, that our connection to this land means nothing to the men who make laws in distant cities. Maybe a marriage between Apache and White can show that we can change without losing everything that makes us who we are." She paused, staring into the fire with eyes that held flames and deeper truths. "Or maybe it will just be another failure. But doing nothing guarantees we'll fade away like morning mist in the desert sun. At least this way, we're choosing our own path instead of letting others choose for us." The magnitude of what she was volunteering for left him speechless. She wasn't just accepting marriage to a stranger. She was offering to be an experiment in survival, a test of whether two different ways of seeing the world could coexist in the same heart. They talked through the night, mapping the vast territories that separated their experiences. She told him about learning to find water by watching the flight patterns of birds, about her time with the Franciscan nuns, about the songs that connected her people to ancestors who had walked this land since time began. He told her about Ohio winters and cattle drives, about the weight of a gun in his hand and the sound a man makes when he dies far from home. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Thaddeus realized something had shifted in his understanding of himself. For the first time in years, he wasn't planning. His next move wasn't keeping one foot pointed toward the horizon. The woman beside him represented everything he'd been running from. Yet instead of panic, he felt something that might have been peace. The sun rose over the Sonoran Desert, illuminating a landscape that suddenly looked less like a wasteland and more like home. In the growing light, Ayana's face showed the same quiet transformation, as if she too had discovered something unexpected in the ruins of her old certainties. "When we were children," she said, "my grandmother told me that the desert tests everyone who enters it. Some it kills, some it drives away, but a few it claims as its own. I think maybe last night the desert claimed both of us." The days that followed brought challenges neither formal ceremonies nor nighttime conversations had prepared them to face. Thaddeus discovered that living among the Apache meant unlearning everything he thought he knew about surviving in the desert. His horse Sherman, a sturdy bay gelding that had carried him faithfully across 3 territories, seemed clumsy and loud compared to Apache ponies that moved across rocky terrain like shadows given form. Ayana became his teacher in matters both practical and profound. She showed him how to read the subtle signs that indicated water beneath apparently barren ground, how to identify plants that could provide medicine or food, how to move through the desert without leaving traces that would betray their presence to enemies. Her knowledge seemed limitless, drawn from generations of accumulated wisdom and sharpened by her own keen intelligence. But teaching him to survive in her world proved easier than bridging the cultural chasm that separated their understanding of fundamental concepts. The Apache operated on communal principles that ran counter to everything Thaddeus had learned about self-reliance. Decisions affecting the group were made through consensus rather than individual authority, and the concept of owning land seemed as foreign to them as their spiritual connection to the desert seemed to him. The wiki-up they shared began to feel less temporary as Ayana added touches that transformed the simple structure into something approaching home. She wove grass mats for the floor, arranged their few possessions with an eye for both beauty and practicality, created a space that felt intimate without feeling cramped. Thaddeus found himself looking forward to evenings when they would sit by their small fire, sharing the day's events and attempting to understand the vast differences in their worldviews. Their physical relationship developed slowly, constrained by mutual uncertainty and the knowledge that their entire community was watching for signs of success or failure. They slept on opposite sides of their shelter for the first week, maintaining careful distance that spoke more of nervousness than lack of attraction. When they finally came together as husband and wife, it was with tenderness that surprised them both, a recognition that they were creating something entirely new rather than fulfilling expected roles. The morning after brought their first real test. Apache scouts reported cavalry approaching from the east, blue-coated soldiers representing everything that threatened their way of life. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Whitfield commanded the patrol, a career officer whose reputation for brutal efficiency had earned him promotion and the bitter hatred of every Apache band from the Chiricahuas to the Mescaleros. Thaddeus found himself caught between worlds, pulled between loyalty to his new family and the uncomfortable reality that he shared blood and culture with the men who posed an existential threat to their survival. His presence in the camp would be impossible to explain if Whitfield's soldiers discovered them. Yet leaving would abandon Ayana and her people when they needed every capable fighter. The solution Ayana proposed demonstrated both her intelligence and understanding of the delicate balance they were all trying to maintain. Rather than hiding Thaddeus or sending him away, she suggested he could serve as intermediary, someone who could approach the cavalry without immediately triggering violent confrontation. His presence wouldn't guarantee peaceful resolution, but it might create opportunities for negotiation that would otherwise be impossible. The plan required Thaddeus to ride out alone carrying a white flag and a carefully constructed story that would explain his presence in Apache territory without revealing the camp's location. He would claim to be a prospector who had been captured and recently escaped someone with information about Apache movements that might prove valuable to the military. Ayana helped him prepare for the deception, coaching him on details that would make his story convincing, while avoiding information that could be used against the real camp. She cut his hair to suggest weeks of neglect, used plant dyes to create fake bruises and rope burns, even tore his clothes in ways that would imply rough treatment without damaging their functionality. The morning of his departure, she presented him with a small medicine pouch that had belonged to her grandfather. The leather was soft from years of handling, worn smooth by countless fingers, seeking comfort in its familiar weight. Accepting it felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. "This will protect you during your journey," she said, "and remind you that you carry not just your own hopes, but the dreams of everyone who calls this place home." The ride to intercept Whitfield's patrol took him across terrain he was only beginning to understand, through canyons where Apache had hidden from enemies for generations, across mesas offering commanding views of the surrounding desert. Every mile increased his appreciation for tactical advantages that made the Apache such formidable opponents despite their small numbers. He found the cavalry exactly where scouts had predicted, following an old mining road that provided easy passage through rocky landscape, but made them visible from miles away. 24 soldiers commanded by an officer whose bearings suggested both competence and cruelty, riding in formation that prioritized military precision over tactical awareness. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield proved to be exactly what Thaddeus expected: a man in his 40s, whose weathered face bore the stamp of too many years imposing military solutions on complex problems. His uniform remained immaculate despite dust and heat, his weapons well maintained, his manner that of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The interrogation that followed tested every aspect of the deception Ayana had helped construct. Whitfield's questions came rapidly and from unexpected angles, probing for inconsistencies that might reveal truth about Thaddeus's recent experiences. How long had he been captive? Which band had taken him? What had he observed about their numbers, weapons, intentions? Thaddeus answered with mixture of truth and carefully crafted fiction, drawing on genuine knowledge of Apache culture, while misdirecting attention away from Nalish's actual location and capabilities. He described a band of perhaps 15 warriors, led by a chief he called Red Wolf, supposedly camped near Sanita Basin and planning raids along the Gila River. What made the deception successful wasn't the perfection of lies, but the authenticity of emotions behind them. Thaddeus's nervousness was genuine, his exhaustion real, his concern about Apache intentions absolutely sincere. Whitfield saw a man who had been through traumatic experience and was struggling to process information that might prevent further bloodshed. The critical moment came when Whitfield offered escort back to the nearest military post. Refusing would immediately raise questions about his true motivations, but accepting meant abandoning Ayana when she most needed his support. Thaddeus chose a middle path that satisfied military protocol while preserving his freedom. He claimed his prospecting equipment remained cached near his original capture site, and that recovering those tools was essential to his economic survival. If Whitfield could provide military escort to retrieve his supposed mining gear, he would submit to full debriefing afterward. The bargain struck. Thaddeus led a detail of 6 soldiers on a circuitous route that took them farther from Nalish's actual position, while appearing to follow logical path toward his fictional mining claim. By evening, they reached a site that could plausibly have served as a mining camp, complete with evidence of recent excavation and basic equipment a lone prospector might have abandoned during hasty escape. When they parted company the following morning, Whitfield seemed satisfied he had extracted all available intelligence. His patrol continued north toward the Mogollon Rim, chasing shadows and false trails, while the real Apache camp prepared to relocate to positions virtually impossible for cavalry to reach. Thaddeus's return was greeted with mixture of relief and celebration that made him understand he truly belonged among these people. His successful deception had purchased time that might mean the difference between survival and destruction. Ayana's welcome was particularly warm, combining personal relief with recognition that her husband had demonstrated both courage and cunning in facing a challenge that could have destroyed everything they were building together. The medicine pouch had returned with him, apparently having provided the protection she promised. That night, as they lay together in their wickiup with desert silence wrapped around them like a blanket, Ayana placed her hand on his chest and spoke words that would echo in his memory for years to come. Today you proved that the bridge between our worlds can carry more than just two people learning to love each other. It can carry the hopes of everyone who believes that enemies can become family when survival depends on choosing trust over fear. The reprieve purchased by Thaddeus's deception lasted exactly 11 days. Apache scouts brought word that Whitfield had discovered the truth about the mining camp, probably through reports from other prospectors who knew the area and could confirm no serious excavation had ever taken place there. Worse still, the colonel was now moving systematically through the desert, checking every canyon and water source with the methodical approach of a man who understood he had been deliberately misled. Even more troubling, Whitfield had been reinforced. 2 additional patrols had joined his command, bringing his total force to nearly 70 soldiers equipped with modern rifles and enough supplies to sustain an extended campaign. The military was preparing for a comprehensive sweep of the region, designed to locate and eliminate every Apache band operating outside the reservation system. The news struck the camp like lightning hitting dry timber. Some families began packing immediately, preparing to flee deeper into mountains where cavalry horses couldn't follow. Others gathered around Nailish, seeking guidance from the elder, whose wisdom had kept them alive through decades of warfare and persecution. Thaddeus found himself facing a crisis of identity that cut to the core of who he believed himself to be. His successful deception had been possible precisely because he shared cultural background and physical appearance of the soldiers hunting his adopted family. That same advantage now felt like burden reminder that he could escape approaching disaster simply by walking away, reverting to his old identity as drifter with no permanent attachments. The temptation was stronger than he cared to admit. His marriage to Ayana, while binding according to Apache customs, would mean nothing to the outside world. He could disappear into vast anonymity of American frontier, find work on some distant ranch, rebuild his life as if these weeks among Apache had been nothing more than an extended dream. But watching Ayana help her people prepare for what might be their final stand, seeing quiet dignity with which they faced prospect of death or capture, he understood that running would destroy something essential in his character. These people had welcomed him not because of what he could do for them, but because they recognized something in him that he was only beginning to understand himself. The debate about how to respond revealed deep philosophical divisions within the Apache community. Older warriors favored traditional tactics, harassment and ambush, striking quickly, then melting back into landscape, making the desert itself their ally, in campaign of attrition that could continue indefinitely. Younger men argued for decisive confrontation, claiming that running would only postpone inevitable while allowing military to dictate terms of engagement. Ayana proposed a third option so radical that even Nalish initially dismissed it without serious consideration. Rather than fighting or fleeing, she suggested attempting to negotiate peaceful resolution that might allow her people to remain in traditional territory while formally acknowledging American sovereignty over the region. The idea wasn't entirely without precedent. Other tribes had negotiated treaties allowing them to maintain some degree of autonomy while accepting federal oversight. The problem was that most such agreements had eventually been broken by one side or the other, usually when economic pressures made Indian lands appear valuable to white settlers. But Ayana's proposal had one crucial advantage previous negotiations had lacked. Thaddeus could serve as cultural interpreter and advocate, someone who understood both worlds and could help bridge communication gap that had doomed so many earlier diplomatic efforts. The plan that emerged from 3 days of intense discussion was breathtakingly audacious. Rather than waiting for Whitfield to find them, a small delegation would approach the cavalry commander under flag of truce, offering to negotiate comprehensive agreement that could serve as model for resolving similar conflicts throughout the Southwest. Thaddeus would lead this delegation accompanied by Nailish and two respected warriors who could speak for the military societies that traditionally made decisions about war and peace. Ayanna would remain with the main camp, both to coordinate defensive preparations if negotiations failed, and to serve as guarantee that the delegation hadn't simply abandoned their people in search of individual safety. The night before their departure, Thaddeus and Ayanna sat together beside their small fire, both acutely aware they might never see each other again. The conversation that passed between them carried weight of everything they had discovered about love and partnership during their brief time together, everything they hoped to build if survival proved possible. She gave him a new medicine bundle, this one prepared specifically for the challenge he was about to face. Inside the soft leather pouch were items connecting him to her family lineage, a piece of turquoise that had belonged to her grandmother, a small carved bone representing protection of ancestors, a fragment of sage gathered during the ceremony that made him part of the Apache community. This will remind you that you carry not just your own hopes, she told him, but the dreams of generations who have struggled to preserve our way of life in a world that seems determined to destroy it. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like heavy coat, adding gravity to mission that already felt impossibly difficult. He was being asked to save not just immediate members of Nalish's band, but entire cultural heritage they represented. The ride to intercept Whitfield's enlarged force took them through terrain that seemed designed to showcase both beauty and danger of Sonoran Desert. Ancient saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against skies so blue it hurt to look at directly, their arms raised in gestures that seemed to offer either blessing or warning. They found the military camp beside natural tank that collected rainwater during brief but violent storms that periodically swept across the desert. The soldiers had established proper perimeter with sentries posted at strategic intervals, their discipline reflecting both professional competence and serious intent to complete their mission, regardless of cost. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield emerged from his command tent, looking like a man who had been expecting this development. His greeting was formal, but not hostile, acknowledging courage required for former enemies to present themselves voluntarily while maintaining wariness of someone who had learned not to trust appearances in Indian country. The negotiations stretched across 3 days with each side probing for weaknesses while attempting to construct framework that could satisfy their fundamental requirements. Whitfield needed to demonstrate his campaign had achieved measurable results. The Apache needed guarantees allowing them to maintain connection to ancestral lands while adapting to political realities of American expansion. Thaddeus found himself serving multiple roles simultaneously: translator, when language barriers threatened discussions; cultural interpreter, when misunderstandings arose from fundamentally different worldviews; mediator, when emotions threatened to overwhelm rational discourse. The breakthrough came when Nalish offered to relocate his band to a specific area that would place them under nominal federal supervision while allowing them to maintain traditional lifestyle. The proposed territory included several important sacred sites and sufficient game to support their subsistence economy, but was remote enough to avoid conflicts with white settlers. Thaddeus offered the crucial element that made agreement possible. He would remain with the Apache band as permanent liaison, someone who could serve as both monitor and advocate, ensuring terms were honored by both sides, while providing early warning if circumstances began deteriorating toward renewed hostilities. The terms that emerged were more generous than anyone had dared hope, yet more restrictive than anyone wanted to accept. The Apache would be granted use rights to approximately 50 square miles of traditional territory. In exchange, they would acknowledge American sovereignty, accept federal oversight, and refrain from actions that could be construed as hostile. The signing ceremony took place at sunset on the third day, with representatives gathering around small tables set up in neutral ground between their camps. Thaddeus signed as federal representative, his signature creating legal obligations that would bind him to this place and these people for the foreseeable future. The moment felt historic, pregnant with possibilities that could reshape relationships throughout Southwest if the experiment proved successful. Yet everyone present understood They had created nothing more than opportunity, a chance to discover whether enemies could become neighbors when survival depended on mutual cooperation. The return to camp was subdued, each member of the delegation lost in private thoughts about what they had accomplished and what challenges lay ahead. Thaddeus found himself thinking about Ayana, wondering how she would respond to news that her husband had voluntarily chosen to bind himself permanently to her people and their fate. Her welcome was everything he could have hoped for, combining personal joy with recognition that their partnership had become something larger than either had originally envisioned. They were no longer simply two individuals learning to love each other across cultural boundaries. They had become symbols of possibility, living proof that reconciliation was achievable when people were willing to risk everything for the chance of building something better. The months following tested every aspect of the agreement in ways negotiators had anticipated and others that caught everyone by surprise. Federal bureaucrats questioned the precedent of granting semi-autonomous status to Indian bands, fearing success might encourage similar demands from other tribes. Military commanders worried the Apache territory could become refuge for hostile elements from other regions. Settlers complained that valuable land was being wasted on people who would never contribute meaningfully to territorial development. From the Apache perspective, challenges were equally daunting. Living under federal oversight required accepting restrictions on traditional practices that had defined their identity for generations. Young warriors chafed at being unable to raid enemies, who continued encroaching on lands that had once belonged exclusively to their people. Elders worried that contact with American culture would corrupt their children and destroy spiritual connections that gave meaning to Apache existence. Through all these difficulties, Thaddeus and Ayana worked to maintain delicate balance that kept their experimental community functioning. They mediated disputes between Apache families and federal representatives, translated not just language, but entire ways of understanding the world, demonstrated through their own relationship that cooperation across cultural boundaries was both possible and rewarding. Their first child was born in spring, following the agreement, a daughter whose mixed heritage embodied everything her parents hoped to achieve. She would grow up speaking Apache and English with equal fluency, comfortable in both worlds, yet fully belonging to neither. She would inherit traditions from ancestors who had never met, yet shared common commitment to protecting the land and people they loved. The baby's birth was celebrated by both communities, Apache families bringing traditional gifts, while federal officials sent congratulations acknowledging the symbolic importance of this new life. She represented the future the treaty had made possible, a generation that wouldn't be forced to choose between competing loyalties, but could synthesize the best elements of different cultures into something entirely new. But the most serious test came when a group of renegade Apache from another band raided a settlement 60 miles south, killing 3 families and taking 2 children captive. The territorial governor immediately blamed Nalish's people, despite lack of evidence connecting them to the attack. Newspaper editorials demanded military action against all Apache, regardless of treaty obligations. Settlers organized vigilante committees threatening to take justice into their own hands. Thaddeus found himself walking a tightrope between competing pressures that could destroy everything they had built. Federal authorities demanded he investigate thoroughly and provide evidence that would either exonerate his adopted people or justify military action against them. Apache leaders insisted their band had honored every provision of the treaty and shouldn't be punished for crimes committed by others. The investigation required him to leave Ayana and their infant daughter riding south with a mixed party of Apache scouts and federal marshals to examine the scene of the attack and interview survivors. What they found contradicted the official version of events in ways that made Thaddeus's stomach turn. The raiders had indeed been Apache, but they wore war paint and carried weapons, identifying them as members of Geronimo's band, the same group that had been terrorizing the border region for months. More disturbing still, evidence at the scene suggested the attack had been deliberately staged to implicate peaceful Apache living under treaty protection. Shell casings from government-issue rifles were scattered around the burned homestead, but Apache traditionally used bows or captured weapons, not standard military ammunition. The raiders had left behind items that could only have come from reservation stores, suggesting someone with access to federal supplies was involved in the deception. The trail led to a conspiracy involving corrupt Indian agents who were selling reservation supplies to hostile bands, then using the resulting attacks to justify increased military spending and expanded federal authority over all Apache people. The scheme was designed to make peaceful coexistence appear impossible, forcing Apache onto reservations where they could be controlled more easily while opening their traditional lands to white settlement. Exposing this conspiracy required Thaddeus to choose between protecting his own safety and defending the integrity of the treaty that had made his new life possible. The men involved included federal officials with power to destroy him professionally and personally, military officers who could arrange his death and make it look like Apache treachery, businessmen with enough money to buy silence or violence as needed. But returning to Ayana empty-handed would mean watching their experimental community destroyed by lies and greed, seeing their daughter grow up in a world where treaties were worthless and hope was a luxury only fools could afford. The confrontation came in Tucson, where Thaddeus presented his evidence to territorial authorities in a closed session that would determine the fate of every Apache living under federal protection. The men he accused were present, their lawyers and political allies arrayed against him like artillery preparing to fire. The hearing lasted 6 hours, with Thaddeus presenting physical evidence and witness testimony that painted a picture of systematic corruption reaching to the highest levels of territorial government. His Apache scouts corroborated details about the false flag attack, while federal marshals confirmed that reservation supplies were being diverted to hostile bands. The moment of truth came when the territorial governor asked a simple question: "Mr. Crane, are you willing to stake your reputation and your life on these accusations?" Thaddeus looked around the room at faces that ranged from sympathetic to openly hostile, understanding that his answer would determine not just his own fate, but the survival of everything he had come to love. "Yes, sir," he said, "because the alternative is watching good people pay for crimes they didn't commit, while the real criminals profit from misery they created." The verdict came 3 days later, delivered by territorial authorities who had spent those days verifying evidence and interviewing additional witnesses. The corruption scheme was confirmed, reaching deeper into federal bureaucracy than anyone had imagined. 6 officials were arrested, including the Indian agent who had been skimming supplies and the Army contractor who had been providing weapons to hostile bands. More importantly for Thaddeus and his adopted people, the treaty was not only upheld, but expanded with additional protections put in place to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. The Apache territory was increased to 70 square miles, including more sacred sites and better water sources. Federal oversight would continue, but with new safeguards to ensure officials couldn't abuse their authority. The ride back to the Apache camp took Thaddeus through familiar desert that now looked different, no longer a harsh wasteland to be endured, but a home to be protected and cherished. He had left as a man caught between two worlds. He was returning as someone who had helped create a bridge strong enough to support both. Ayana's welcome included tears. She didn't try to hide relief that her husband had returned safely and pride that he had risked everything to protect their people. Their daughter had grown during his absence, her eyes already showing the alertness that would allow her to navigate the complex world her parents had created for her. That evening, as the 3 of them sat beside their fire, with desert stars wheeling overhead in patterns that had guided travelers for countless generations, Ayana spoke words that captured everything they had accomplished together. "When my father first offered you my hand in marriage, I thought he was giving me to a stranger who had helped us in battle. Now I understand he was giving me to the man who would help us win the war for our survival." The years that followed proved the wisdom of that early bargain. Their experimental community became a model for other treaties, showing that peaceful coexistence was possible when both sides were willing to adapt without abandoning their core values. The Apache children learned English and mathematics alongside traditional skills like tracking and plant medicine. White settlers visited the territory to trade and sometimes stayed to learn desert survival techniques that had been perfected over centuries. Thaddeus and Ayana had 2 more children, a son who grew up equally comfortable with rifle and bow, and another daughter who inherited her mother's gift for languages and her father's stubborn integrity. All 3 children became bridges between worlds, translating not just words but entire ways of understanding the relationship between human beings and the land that sustained them. The desert that had tested them so severely became their greatest ally, teaching lessons about adaptation and endurance that served them well through good times and bad. Drought years that broke many ranches left the Apache territory largely unaffected because traditional knowledge about water conservation and drought-resistant crops proved superior to farming methods imported from wetter climates. When Thaddeus reached his 60th year, he looked back on a life that had been transformed by a single moment of choosing honor over safety. The rootless drifter, who had once measured his worth by how quickly he could disappear, had become a pillar of a community that depended on his presence for its continued existence. Ayana, now a grandmother whose wisdom was sought by Apache and white settlers alike, had fulfilled her father's hopes beyond his wildest dreams. She had indeed become a bridge between worlds, but more than that, she had helped create a new world that drew strength from multiple traditions without being enslaved by any of them. On quiet evenings, when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain, they would sit together as they had that first night watching their grandchildren play games that combined Apache and American traditions into something entirely new. The fire that burned between them had never dimmed, fed by shared purpose and mutual respect that had deepened with each challenge they had faced together. The blood that had brought them together had been washed clean by years of building rather than destroying, creating, rather than choosing hope over fear whenever the choice presented itself. Their marriage had become more than union between two people. It had become proof that enemies could become family when survival depended on recognizing their common humanity. As the stars emerged one by one in the vast desert sky, same stars that had witnessed their first tentative conversations about love and duty, Thaddeus understood that he had finally found what he had been searching for during all those years of restless wandering. Not just a place to belong, but a purpose worthy of whatever sacrifice it might require. The desert had claimed him completely, making him part of its eternal story of survival